Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly webinar series, Embracing Change. So today we have a special guest, Ramia, who's CEO of Orbis Terra Media, as well as the editor-in-chief of Tharawat Magazine. So welcome from Switzerland, Ms. Ramia. I don't think you're a stranger to many of the people that are going to be online and listening later. So
that's lovely.
The short introduction I think will do. And as we spoke with Ramia, she decided to have a very, very juicy topic today called entitlement. Being the second generation family business member and myself being a third generation, it will be quite an interesting conversation as we share, especially when our siblings are listening or will listen later.
That's a scary thought, and I would like to say that I feel like you're equally to blame for the topic choice. I'm just saying, I feel like I've been guided this way by you somehow, subconsciously.
Yeah, of course. The God within me spoke to the goddess within you.
It's the genetic hair magic that's happening. Yes, you know, it's bringing out the worst and best in us all. Basically, it's very interesting. So.
Thank you for not taking any responsibility for what's happening right now.
Absolutely, and I'm entitled to that. See, there you go.
Exactly. So, welcome, Ramia. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. Truly, really, thank you very much. I know it's lunchtime and you normally have your special salad that you're gonna either have delayed or will have, I've already had, I don't know which one. So you can tell us later. So before I begin, you put up 2 articles on the LinkedIn as preparation. So if you'd like us to share those post the talk together with the recording, you can share during the talk. Or if there's something else, so that they can have some more learnings to share, maybe a little more objectively than we will today. So Ramia, what does even entitlement mean? Like, what is that, and why does it matter?
Well, I mean, it matters. Well, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? And I've been actually, ever since we've decided on this topic, Feisal, I've been thinking about it even more than I usually do. And so the reason why I even think about entitlement so often is because, of course, I think anyone who's part of a family business gets to think about it quite a lot by the virtue of the dynamics that we all face in a family business. But then because we have, as you know, the magazine deals with family businesses. So we've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of family businesses and witnessed different kinds of family dynamics, and they're starting to see the correlations between those family dynamics and the success of those companies. And so what makes them successful, what makes them last, especially across generations. So that's why we think about entitlement a lot. And for me, it's very interesting, of course, like entitlement, basically in the negative sense, I would say that we look at entitlement, it really relates to the fact that we expect special treatment, or we think we're special in a certain way, right? And I think that the first thing I want to just put out there is that for me, obviously, like everyone has entitlement issues of some sort. Like, you know, if we all dig deep, I think everyone, if you're being very honest with yourself, you hold up that mirror and you really look at it, like I think everyone can admit that they have some sort of sense of entitlement in some area of their lives. Now, so for some people it's more, for some people it's less. I see a lot of it being culturally conditioned. Sometimes it comes from one specific relationship in the family. Sometimes it comes from, you know, as you see a lot as well, from inheriting a lot of material wealth. So it depends a little bit on the context, but I am firmly of the conviction that we all have a sense of entitlement in certain areas of our life. Because ultimately what it boils down to, if we're being very simplistic about it, it's ego, right? And it's ego, and how,
it's both. You know, we all have an ego and we all have entitlement. Now the question is it only for family business, or is it the existence of a human being that it comes with?
I think it's the existence. I think, I'm sure you see this as well. I think that I do think, and I want to talk about this a little bit more, about how I think the setting of the family business can amplify it. Okay. Or I can make that discussion more painful or maybe more urgent than maybe in other areas of life. But I think that every person faces their own sense of entitlement in certain areas of their lives. And I actually think that the times we're living in right now are very interesting when it comes to that, because if you think about it, a lot of the failure in leadership that we're seeing all over the world, I personally believe comes from those people having a sense of entitlement that is actually now corrupting their decision making and is corrupting, and that ego that comes into the way, like, you know, that comes across as a negative thing for them right now, as it comes to making truly altruistic and truly empathetic decisions for many other people. So I think, yeah, so it's a bit of a, it's a very interesting topic for sure. Like, you know, we'll have plenty to talk about.
So let's begin gently. So what you're saying, family businesses amplify it. So give me examples of what behaviors or patterns or ways of being that you see that amplify entitlement.
So I think that first of all, like within the family business context, I want to be very clear about maybe the direction of entitlement that we see, right? Like, because I actually just spoke to my sister about this before coming onto this webinar, and we were talking about, like, you know, what kinds of entitlement do we see, and what kind of entitlement do we accuse each other of in the family business, right? Like, so that's a big one. Blame and shame. I'm not just talking, not necessarily talking about my family alone. Like, we all do it, I would say. I think anyone who's in family business will recognize these. So I want to start maybe counterintuitively with the sense of entitlement that the incumbent generation has. So the generation, so what we call the older generation, or the generation that's in charge, towards the younger generation, because we often talk about the younger generation being entitled.
Yes.
And actually, if I look back at the many people I've talked to over these years who've been kind enough to let us tell their stories, I actually see this kind of entitlement almost more often, where basically the incumbent generation feels entitled to deciding the future of the next generation, feels entitled to defining what their success should look like, because that's how they have defined success for themselves in their generation all these years.
Okay. But is there a difference between founder or second gen, third gen, or is it more founder?
Absolutely. I think it's very, I mean, as you know, the family business dynamics really change depending on what generation you're in and what the circumstances are, right? Like, I think for you and I, we have a lot of things in common, both being part of a family legacy, but then it's very clear you're definitely third generation and I'm clearly second gen. And we have very specific, right? Like, we have very specific dynamics that we deal with regards to, like, you know, the length that the business has existed, or the length that the family has dealt with these kinds of dynamics. But I think what remains is this inherent misunderstanding that entitlement is not like something that just comes with the young. Entitlement is something that is there with the older generation as well. And you're right. I do think that, and it's interesting, I do feel like maybe from the founder to G2, you have it a little bit less, because very often people who found a business, as you know, like, I've not met many founders who set out building a business thinking this is going to be a multi-generational family business. It's not exactly, you know, it's not necessarily the first thing that people think about. These are entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, they build, they create. Of course, they want it to be something that lasts, but the family consideration might come in later, like later on, you know, when the business actually shows a potential to be something to be handed over to the next generation. And so for G2s like myself, there's entitlement of a different nature, maybe coming from very hard having a founding generation parents, like, you know, that work very, very hard, that work for different reasons than we work. That kind of discussion comes in. But it's maybe less so the sense of entitlement to your future. So, for instance, I know that a lot of Gen 2s like me, we get asked probably less frequently to just having to join the family business. Like, it's not necessarily as much as prevalent. I think the Gen 3 actually has that pressure more, because the business legacy is obviously bigger after 2 generations, right? Like, and you feel like, you know, you feel a much bigger pressure of saying, like, well, now you don't want to be the generation. I mean, I don't know if do you feel that way?
I mean, the thing is, you know, for us, it's been pruning, and there's been new businesses. So we created all brand new businesses in our gen. So it is there, but it's not there because it's not a business that was there from generation 1.
So you got a refresher. You got a refresher in a way, and that thing. But
scratch.
When you have that lineage, right? Like, when you have that clear business lineage, then the pressure obviously increases with every generation. So for me, there's the entitlement that goes from the incumbent generation feeling they're entitled to define the future of the next generation. But then there's also the other way, of course, which is basically like, you know, the younger generation feeling entitled to special treatment when they join the business. You know, they feel entitled to the material wealth that maybe has come with the business. They feel entitled to, well, I mean, basically they feel that they are special because, you know, they happen to be born under in this family and into these circumstances. So I think like there's these generational types of entitlement that are there. And I think why entitlement is so particularly detrimental, or like why these things, and I'd love to hear your voice as well on this, Faisal, like, you know, why it is such a big thing in breaking down communication, you know, because it really does that, doesn't it? Like it really breaks down communication between family members, but also between family members and non-family staff, which is like a huge thing, right? But I think for me, why there's such a problem with entitlement in the family business, and the bigger one that may be outside of that context, is because family businesses are driven and grow through entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship, for me, it's very, very clear. You want to be a successful entrepreneur, you need to leave that ego at the door. Like you need to check that ego at the door. You cannot come in and make it all about you. You cannot, it's, you know, because it's humbling. That experience is humbling, working towards that, you know, working as part of something like that. It's a collective notion that you have to bear in mind all the time. So I think that that's why entitlement can be destructive for a family business, because when entitlement overshadows that sense of collective, that sense of like, you know, leaving your ego at the door, it can become very, very difficult for family businesses to continue to thrive across generations. But yeah, so that's a primary observation.
So, I mean, nowadays, a lot of businesses are being built to sell, right? So when businesses are being built to sell, do you see that there's a different approach than what you're sharing? Because that's what's happening now, right? A lot of people are not building companies that they know that, you know, things are changing so fast that it's unrealistic to assume that they will last generations, right? These are non-traditional businesses. Is that, you're seeing that, or still not? You're saying no, that's
I have to confess that I see a lot of people having that need to build that family legacy still. I know what you mean. Like, I think because of the types of technology that have been emerging, I do think that there's a lot of opportunities that will become very fruitful and very interesting. And obviously, like it's a world full of opportunities, full of business opportunities at the moment, which I would say, like, we definitely see a lot of solo entrepreneurship, serial entrepreneurship, etc.
Yeah.
But, you know, Faisal, the thing is, like, you know, we just last week interviewed a 1,000-year-old family business and a 1,400-year-old family business. And, you know, what's really interesting about this is that it's, you know, it's a human need to try to create a sense of forever. We all always strive somehow to have something that will last forever. It's important to us to be able to strive towards these things, even if deep down we all know that things end in some shape or form always. But I think it's almost in defiance of mortality that we always try to build legacies that outlive our own lifetime. So, and I think because that's such a deep human need, I really can't see family businesses as such, or like multi-generational legacies, going away. And I think that particularly now that we're faced with the consequences of short-term capitalist thinking, I actually think that family business thinking is going to come back in vogue a lot, you know. But I think how that ties in also, of course, with the entitlement discussion is that, you know, I think that in the family business, what you're facing now is that fact that, so I'm a millennial, right? Like, so I don't think any generation in the history of humankind has been more accused of entitlement than millennials. I think I can show you, but I don't know how many articles have been written about my generation being entitled, like, you know, not sticking with it, not working hard, wanting all sorts of weird things, half of which I've never experienced. Maybe because I'm in a family business, I've never had that choice, I think, as well. But it's been interesting to think about what that actually looks like. I do think what you're mentioning in terms of, like, you know, the opportunities that are out there, will really challenge the entitlement that the incumbent generation has towards the younger generation. Because you have to understand today, as a family business, sure, I don't think that next gens deserve special treatment coming into the family business. I believe you need to work hard, and I believe it should be based off merit, based off talent and everything. But if you are a family business owner today who wants their next generation to join the business and who wants them to do well, you need to understand exactly what you're saying, which is how many opportunities they currently have out there aside from this. And you need to understand that it is your job to make this an attractive career for people, right? Like, and not just an emotional blackmail pit of, you know, horrifying communication breakdown, basically, you know? So yes, I think that that's important to see that as a task.
But also, I mean, the whole idea, I mean, like you said, I mean, lead the path to that so that there's minimum conflict, right? So I mean, there's many stories I've heard where the person is clearly the next chairman of the company, you know, publicly listed or not, doesn't matter. And the older gen wants to be present for an extended period of time as chairman while the other is the vice chairman. And that's not sustainable unless there's a clearly defined exit time. And it's short, which means 1.5 to 2 years, then only will you create that, you know, that experience so that they are able to build their way into that true ownership of chairmanship.
And I think, you know, you're touching upon such an important point in terms of, like, you know, how do we mitigate entitlement in the family business context? And you just mentioned it. It's a governance issue, isn't it, as well, to a great extent? I mean, you, like, obviously, like, you know, if you have entitlement issues in the family itself, aside from an operating business, that's like, and I'd love you to tell us more also about, because I see that making people sick, like, you know, physically, like, you know, their well-being is absolutely affected by it. But when it comes to the business side, I think there are certain very straightforward, hard solutions that can be implemented to avoid lengthy entitlement discussions with regards to an operating business. And that's obviously everything around, you know, governance, succession planning, all of these things that just put on paper what the rules are and don't allow individuals to make it up as they go along, you know, and I think that will just save your family so much headache, because everyone understands there's a basic way that everyone gets treated. And even if you feel entitled to special treatment, if the rules are there, you know, it's much less of a, well, you're treating me poorly and stuff like that, I feel I should be special and everything. If the rules have been there, have been recorded, everyone has signed the rules, then, you know, there's a sense of, I think, entitlement, it doesn't go away. Maybe people will be disgruntled, but then it also filters out those people who can't get over that sense of entitlement, right? Like, it'll filter out those people who cannot submit to the rules. And you want those people out, quite frankly, whether they're family or not. You don't want those people in your business, because they will stunt the growth. They will demotivate other employees and other leaders in your business. It's not what you want.
So, I mean, Peter Vogel, obviously, at the end of the day, Peter Vogel was here from IMD. And obviously, the reality is, unfortunately, a lot of the governance is just documents. A lot of the constitutions are just documents, and they're very lengthy. So the question also is, are we applying them? So looking at the questions, one of the questions that's come up, and one of the things we talked about with Philip Markovici was state of being, right? Are we able to show up? Now I'm talking about both gens, right? Because you said entitlement is this upper gen and the existing gen. And the question is, am I showing up without imposition, without expectation, and without judgment? And this is the question, is how does entitlement relate to expectations? They seem interchangeable, but have a different emotion attached to it.
Such a great question. Such a great question. I actually think that you are also very good at answering this one in particular, because I think, you know, expectations is like another huge topic in relation to the family business and in relation to family dynamics. Let me put it this way. I think for me, like, how entitlement and expectations interrelate in the family business. And this is, again, like, I'm going to give props to my sister also for mentioning that before when I talked to her about it. When entitlement becomes very tangible in a family that owns a business or operates a business or has family wealth, often it is used as a judgment in the communication, right? And in a weird way, it's used as a judgment, and it's used as a judgment in expressing a disappointment over expectations that aren't met.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So that's how I see the connection. And I think that one of the biggest problems that we have as families working together, or as families being responsible of legacy or wealth, is that we do not really allow each other personal growth. So we're very resilient towards, we want to basically say, I know this person. I know exactly what they're going to say. I know exactly what they're going to do. And the problem is that you're taking away the possibility from that family member to change or to evolve or to surprise you. And that's linked to those expectations. You expect, honestly, like I've seen a lot of family businesses where family members just expect others to disappoint them. Literally, it's like, even if the other person would do really well, they're just saying, like, it's just a matter of time for them to, mess it up. And that becomes very, very, very destructive. And I would say, like, one thing that we are all entitled to, that's like pun intended, but one thing we're all entitled to, I think, is the space and the opportunity to grow and to show ourselves new and refreshed, and to change, and to get that change appreciated by family members, even when we're working together, even when we're constantly together. I think that's one thing that is how, for me, these things kind of interlink. But what about you?
So, I mean, I would look at also the word imposition, right? So there's an expectation, which is something you feel, or maybe it's, it's maybe vocalized, but then it's the imposition both ways, right? That am I imposing my values, my ways, or my expectation on you? So you expect, and then you impose. And when you impose and it doesn't happen, you then judge. So it's really, these are the three words that interplay, right, to create that toxicity. And it was interesting. I was, we had the webinar with Philip Markovici, and I was like, these are the three things I continuously work on with my boys. But at the end of the day, when it finished, I went up to them, because he said, everyone has expectation. Okay. And then I went and I said, you're right. So I told the boys, I said, you know what? Baba was wrong. Actually, he does have an expectation. And the expectation is that you give 100% to everything without being attached to the outcome. The outcome is irrelevant, but you need to give 100%. So there is an expectation. So claiming, even myself who does this for a living, and I work on this, and I have all kinds of people, taking my guts out on a weekly basis, even myself, that was always there, and I didn't even realize it.
But don't you think that the moment that you say these things, the moment that you verbalize, right? I feel like it changes everything. Right? The moment that you're able to, we all have expectations. I don't think we get up in the morning without having expectations, because inversely, expectations are also linked to hope, which is in a very important ingredient to our happiness. Like, you need hope, and hope fosters and feeds expectations. There's nothing wrong with it. Exactly.
Needs desire.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think where it goes wrong, or where it becomes negative, is if, it transforms into something like entitlement, or something like a judgment towards the other person. So I think the moment that you own these things, it's very important. I feel like, for me, it's very important to know exactly in which areas of my life I have entitlement issues, and I have them like every other person. And I know where they come from, and I know that they influence my behavior, they influence my sensibilities. I think it's if you want to work with family, it's very important to confront yourself with always, or being able to ask yourself in every situation, is this ego or is this facts? When you make a decision, what is getting affected? Why am I feeling this way? Is it because it's coming from that person and my ego gets, rises up against this, triggers, thank you, perfect word. My ego gets triggered. Or is it the facts that I disagree with? And if you this is a huge exercise, I think, that we all try to practice. We all fail at regularly all the time, of course, because there's no one no one like family that can push you to the brink, obviously, as much, right? Like, because they know how to push your buttons. But I think the more you practice that, the more you can say, well, you know what, like, I'm aware, like, and this is what you did, right? Like, you foster awareness around it. Even your kids are aware and can even distinguish between, like, you know, what you're saying versus what you're expecting versus how you make them feel. And I think that's just human, like, that's just family dynamics, and there's nothing wrong with having expectations. I mean, I think you'd be inhuman if you didn't have expectations from your children, right? Like, that doesn't, I mean, I think it's impossible.
I've been called that, so it's okay. It's okay. You're not the first one.
Really? All right. Okay.
So here they're asking, how do you speak to your family about entitlement? I mean, we've been talking about it. I just hinted on it, but how do you have that conversation? Do you bring in a third party? Do you share your own sense of entitlement? Do you, is there a process? What have you seen that's worked or hasn't worked?
Okay, so I've seen many different approaches, and I do think it depends on how urgent a situation entitlement has created, right? Like, obviously, I think there's a huge difference between you talking about a family that is actively dysfunctional right now in its communication, is fighting all the time, and, you know, the conflict has already erupted, versus a family that is aware that there are things that are not fully functional and should be addressed, etc. I think there's a big difference between conflict having erupted and you know, you're being
one is acute and one is
exactly
manageable. Okay.
So I think from what I've seen, obviously, talking to all the families, but also in our own, I do think that especially when the conflict becomes acute and when, like, you know, there's people have already been hurt, things have been said that you can't take back, I do recommend taking a third party on board, simply because it is very hard to break down those walls that are being built and to really get back to the actual issue without someone who is neutral guiding the process. So, like, I'm not saying that someone else can do the work for you, but I definitely think, you know, a neutral third party can help you have the conversation you're actually trying to have, and not the conversation, you know, the conversation that the conflict is making you have. When it comes to prevention, I would say, like, you know, you're in a family business and you know everyone has entitlement issues, you know, everyone's like, you know, we're all like kind of, I always say, like, it's very comforting talking to so many family businesses. Reminds me that my family isn't crazy. Like, everyone has their issues, right? Like, so, but I think when it comes to that, I'm a firm believer in leading by example. So if you want other members of your family to confront certain things, if you want other members of your family or in your business to behave in a certain way, I firmly believe that it's futile to have that expectation or to hope for this unless you yourself embody that behavior yourself. So, you know, for me, one thing that I've talked to a lot of next gens about is, like, you know, they're saying, like, oh, they won't listen. They're not, like, you know, no one is listening to me. I have ideas and stuff like that. And then I always tell them, like, you know, look to your behavior in general, not just with regards to you have great ideas, but just generally, what are the things that are currently undermining your credibility?
Exactly.
Right? And because I believe in leading by example, I believe that when you can become inspirational to your family members, to your other family members, and it is possible, I think that's when you truly unlock the potential that is that familyness, really, that really makes everything richer and better. But I don't think that, I think there's a hypocrisy there, of course, because we always know it better for others, right? I'm sure you like, for you, it must be very interesting with genetic care, right? Like, because obviously it's one thing to see the solution for someone else, but it's so much harder to apply it to ourselves. But when you manage that, I think it's the most powerful thing that can happen to you in a family business, because it forces the other family members not just to listen to your words, but to see your actions proving your point. And I think there's nothing that comes close to that in a transformative power within the family.
So taking that conversation further, there's a question saying, who owns the right to establish the rules and definitions of entitlement in families? Right? So who decides? Because if entitlement is both ways, right? And you know, you said bring in a third party, and we know that the issues continue, right? There's 30% from second to third, only 9% from third to fourth that are actually able to, to do the succession. Obviously, whatever we're doing isn't working. And from my perspective, it's not just the third party. The element that's important is each individual, like you said, to the next gen, doing the work that they're able to show up without imposition, expectation, and judgment. Because even if there's a third party and everybody comes fully loaded, with their cannons and machine guns and guns and whatever they're planning to bring with them, right? Then the poor third party is just basically going to be, even if they create the safe space, even if they're most incredible at doing that, they still have to process. Each human being has to process, like you said, the relevant versus the irrelevant. Yeah. So the really relevant from the noise, right? But again, this person is asking, who has the right to define the rules and the definition of what is entitlement that's acceptable versus not? So if you want to reflect, I can tell a story in the meantime, but if you're ready, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to, can I just first say something about this whole statistic of family businesses fail in the third generation and don't make it further and stuff like that. I always find it very important to say this, by the way.
Okay,
Can we just take a step back and just look at the average age any business reaches these days? Because you have to understand that family businesses outdo that age in the first generation. And for me, I'm a big advocate of us, not saying this anymore, simply because if you've gotten to the third generation in your family legacy, whatever happens next, you've done an incredible job.
You're a superstar. Yes.
You're a superstar. And it's amazing. And I think that, so I'm always I'm a bit defensive of the third and the fourth generation because I don't like this this idea of.
I won't use the statistic anymore.
No, please do if you want to. Please do if you want to. But I know where the statistic comes from, and for me, it's very important. We need to contextualize, right? So nowadays, I just don't think that's necessarily a fair judgment to pass or a fair expectation to have. When it comes to the right, I totally agree with you, Feisal. I think bringing in a third party doesn't take away from the fact that this needs to be a family-centric process. You still need to take those decisions yourself. You still need to look at your own culture and see what's right. I do think it's interesting, who has the right? It's a very interesting question if you think about it. And I'm going to be a little bit, maybe it's going to sound evasive, but I have a point. It is dependent, I think, on context and the times we live in. Okay, so let me refer to the time we live in now, because that's the one I know best, right? Yeah. I really think that today, a family business leadership is a team sport. I really believe, and there's some of my academic friends will back me up in this, that the era of the lone wolf, as Claudia Astrakhan has called it, is over. The idea of one person taking all those decisions, knowing what, and that's simply because the complexity of the world is such that it is just impossible for one person to know it all. Yeah. So if I look at this question,
to go through without having too many gaps in the system.
Exactly. And I think so for me, it's, leadership has really become a team sport in this 21st century. And I can see that those families that have understood that, I feel like they're going to go far. They're going to exceed many generations because they've understood what, collective leadership looks like, what joint decision making looks like, and stuff like that. For families that are in that situation have recognized that, I feel like the right to establish those rules has also to be a collective effort. It has to be gotten to through a very iterative and probably extremely difficult process of coming to an agreement together. And I actually even think it should be a multi-generational process. Exactly. So not just one generation, but in conversation with the next generations, potentially, to set the framework, because you can never know what's right for the next wave of family members coming in. It's impossible for you to understand what it's like. I mean, I see it now as well. For me, it's impossible to understand what this reality looks like for Gen Z, right? For your boys, for instance, right? And it's very hard for us to understand how they view the world. And that's why their view is important in establishing these rules. Now, going a little bit back, I do understand that there are circumstances where, especially when we're talking founder-led family businesses still, when we're talking, you know, like there's a maybe rags to riches story where like a huge amount of wealth has been created, like, you know, in one generation, which we know happens a lot in the countries that you and I are active in and come from. I do think that maybe there is a sense of like, you know, if you have the founding entrepreneur who is clearly the one who's created the whole thing, does she or he have the right to decide that first transition on their own? I don't recommend it, but I guess I would understand it in a certain way. You know what I mean? Because there's that sense of, again, you maybe didn't start out thinking of it as a family business. And, you know, you made all of that effort. I still wouldn't recommend it, but I guess I would understand that then there will be more of a incumbent generation who decides kind of a, you know, sense. What do you think?
I mean, the thing is, there's a question about culture, right? And how culture looks like in expectations and entitlement. And I think 100%, right? I do a lot of speaking, as you know, and when we're sitting listening to panels, and it's just incredible to see the Asians versus some of the Western world, and the huge discrepancy between the two of how a lot of the Western world is asking the next gen to decide what the structure should look like, what the governance should be like based on their value system, while a lot of us in Asia are still holding on to that power, quote unquote, right? And the power through either funds or money or ownership or whatever it is, right? So it's how do we learn to let go, and when do you let go? And when, you know, we work with families and the next gen asks, but we don't have a voice. We didn't earn the money, right? We're 16 to 25 years old, right? Why would they listen to us? And we work with them to coach them. And then when they show up in that 3-generation conversation, they realize that their voice matters, because at the end of the day, the legacy is being brought forward for them, right? So it's you know, even though I haven't earned it, right? I'm told that I'm part of it, and I'm the future owner, right? But I have responsibilities, right? So with responsibility comes also rights. So that's where, you know, expectation, entitlement, judgment, right? It's a really, you know, it's a very fine line.
It's a fine line. I agree with you. It's a very fine line. And it's also sometimes a very subjective line, right? Like it's a very subjective line, because I can see it with, you know, my generation and my parents' generation, right? Like there's a fundamental disagreement sometimes on, like, you know, what constitutes like what you're entitled to, what you earned, what your merit is, what, like, you know,
another word that came in the question. What
you
is
know,
between merit or,
you know, and this is the thing, right? Like, what do you do if, like, you know, you let everyone into the business under the same structure, under the same circumstances, but one does so clearly much better than the other? You know, like, does then merit supersede the entitlement discussion? And do you know, so that's also, so there's a lot of things at play. But I think that the most important thing to realize is that even if you're in charge and you feel, of course, like, you know, the thing is that you have to, I always feel like it's one thing we have to be very fair about. Sure, next gens, younger people, you're like, you know, I don't think it's justified to be entitled. I don't think you ought to feel like you're entitled to the money or to the wealth or to even the success and stuff like that. But let's not forget one thing. When you're young, you can't possibly know what you're going to feel like 30 years from now. But when you're 30 years from now, you damn well remember what it was like to be young. And if you pretend like you don't, you're being a hypocrite, right? That's number one. Number two, if you really want this to be a family business or a family legacy, you need to understand that success will look different from one generation to another. And I just did a very interesting podcast with my friend Guillermo Salazar on what he calls the hero's journey. And he talks about how the founder's story, right? Like, so the hero's journey can become a positive force, but can also become a haunting ghost for the family members that follow, because nobody can ever live up to the drama of the founding story. So you also have to understand that entitlement sometimes is a defense mechanism, in my experience, right? Because it gives you a sense of importance, because there's no way that you can live up to that dramatic founder story other than convincing yourself that you're special by birth, basically, or that you're special by, you know, because your mom told you so. Like, you know, so I think this is also like, we have to understand, like, under the underlying psychological aspect of this is a certain level of defensiveness, because I'll be very honest with you, Faisal, if I look very closely, most people in my circles that I would call entitled, they're not bad people. And unfortunately, most of the people that I would call really clearly entitled in my circle as well, they're also, if you look really closely, quite deeply unhappy. You know, and that's the thing, right? Like, because entitlement is super irritating. When you watch, like, you know, it really gets under your skin.
For the person who's
for the people who are like, you know, no, for the people who are experiencing it. But I always encourage people to maybe just, like, you know, understand that, again, like, I think it's sometimes a defense mechanism, and also don't underestimate, like, a person who's entitled is not necessarily happy. It might just be the only way for them to validate their existence, or to give themselves the confidence.
It's the identity,
and to give themselves the identity, right? And then you need to ask very different questions. You need to ask, why does that person feel that way? Why don't they see other opportunities to prove themselves in their lives and to establish their own self-worth in a healthier way than via the family legacy, for instance, right?
Okay, so let me take a flip side. So I was born, my father made the wealth, right? So we grew up pretty, you know, very, very comfortably, very well. Money was kind of a given, right? It wasn't really an issue. And so now I grow up, and you as a father and mother have raised me with these nice cars and this nice, comfortable, okay, I'm not talking about business class, first class, but still, right? You're traveling, you're going on holidays, you're able to go to university, you go with your cashier order, which I know people don't use anymore, right? To pay your school fees. It's a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And now you're telling me I need to go figure, right? I need to go earn my own living. I need to buy my own home. I need to do all of those things, and I had to live according to my means. But then why did you, quote unquote, spoil me, right, when I was growing up, right? I'm just giving an example.
Absolutely.
Fortunately, it didn't happen to me, but I'm giving an example now. So what is my right, or what should I expect, even if I say, right, even if my father said, you will receive nothing, do I truly believe him?
Well, I mean, I think that's also a question of, like, what kind of entitlement you feel. If your entitlement is material, of course, then this is a very frustrating situation, because if you feel entitled to the money, then
okay, I lived in a comfortable home. Today I can't afford one. Should I expect to have a comfortable home provided by my parents because they are wealthy, right?
Well, I mean,
I went on all these, you know, incredible vacations, and today I can't afford to. Am I entitled to that, right? So am I entitled basically to the lifestyle you raised me in, right? Because I know you have the wealth. So am I entitled to it or not, right? And I'll tell you another story that's very different. So what are you seeing? What are your thoughts, but what are you seeing families doing in those circumstances?
Well, I'll ask another question. Is it going to get you anywhere to ask that question? Because you know what I'm trying to say, like, this is the thing that I see a lot. Like, so I see this a lot in family businesses. When you talk to the next gen, I've had this conversation more times than I can count, right? Like, there's this sense of, like, but why did my parents, but why did my parents, but why did my parents? And there comes a point in your adult life where, even though your parents are there, you have to, I guess, decide whether you're going to forever be a victim, right, of the well-intentioned, although maybe misguided efforts of your parents, right? Like, because of course they did their best
with their level of consciousness.
And you need to realize that at some point there's a very important trigger that I feel that will define your happiness as an adult. Is you have to forgive your parents for whatever you feel they've done wrong, and you need to do it fast, because otherwise you're going to spend your whole adult life hampered in your own ability to take charge. Because yes, you can look at it this way. You can look at it like, oh, you spoiled me and all of these things, and now you're suddenly taking it all away. But they've given you all of that for all of these years, right? That is riches. That is riches, right?
And yeah,
it's the gratitude. It's the gratitude trigger, right? Like it's the gratitude trigger, and then the forgiveness trigger. Because of course, Faisal, like, you know, I do understand the feeling of injustice. Like, you know, parents do treat their kids unfairly sometimes, just like kids, I'm sure, treat their parents unfairly sometimes. And but in a family, if you want a family unity, forgiveness is the first principle. Like, you know, if you're not willing to forgive anymore, you need to distance yourself. Honestly, because all you're going to do is you're going to keep on making everyone more and more miserable. You have to be allowed, you have to enable yourself to forgive. And I think, and then the next part of it is also like, you know, of course, like I think that there's this difference between entitlement towards what you're entitled to in terms of material goods. And then there's the emotional entitlement. What kind of a emotional support and belief am I entitled to from my parents, for instance, like, you know, or generally my family members, even my siblings, right? Like, I mean, your family should believe in you, right? Like, regardless, like, you know, your family should stand behind you no matter what choices you take and stuff like that. And the fact of the matter is, like, yes, ideally, that's the case. There's unconditional, but humanly, it's not possible, right? Like, to achieve, like, it's not possible. And the weird thing is, like, when that is lacking, when there's not that sense of, like, you know, like unconditional love, or like, you know, really standing by each other, then the material entitlement tends to become more important.
So it's the gap. So you're basically saying when there's a gap and the space is there, it becomes
more important, because you see it as a reflection of love. You think that at that moment in time when your father decides, or whoever's father decides, to not give you the money, they're withdrawing love. They're withdrawing approval. And unfortunately, and you're right, in our parts of the world, unfortunately, very often material goods and money are used as emotional blackmail to make kids do, you know, for control. Exactly. I love that word. I hate and love it, basically. So, so that's, I think that's a very important distinction to make, and to understand how these two things, like, sort of link with each other.
It's quite funny here. So there's a comment here. One would also need to grow up and try making a life, knowing that in worst case scenario, you can go back to the nice, comfortable house.
I know the person who asked that, who said that. So
that's a trampoline that's waiting. You jump out the window. Don't worry, jump out the window, but there's a net at the bottom in case you fail. I mean, come on.
Well, okay. He has, like, you know, he has such a, I know this person particularly, because, and I know that he's one of those people that I cite when I say, like, you know, you lead by example. Yeah. He's that kind of person. And I think that it's hard sometimes, it's a lonely place sometimes, depending on, like, you know, what kind of family dynamics you're exposed to. If you've come to that level of recognition and the rest of your family hasn't, sometimes I think that's an isolating phenomenon. But I definitely agree that, I mean, it's interesting. There was this family in Costa Rica that I went to visit a few years ago, and they have like 5 generations, 7 branches of the family. Like, you know, the event that I spoke at was just for their family members, and there were 200 people or something like that. Something, you know, something really insane. So it was really beautiful and everything. And if you see, like, how they did it, they were like, they spent 7 years building a governance structure that involved everybody's voices. A beautiful case study. I
hope it's short.
But how they did it basically is they said, like, you know what, everyone is going to benefit from the business, but you're not allowed to benefit from the business unless you yourself have a career and work. So you don't get any of the dividends unless you can show that you are profitably and, like, you know, lucratively, exactly. You're either contributing in the business, or you have your own career. You know, you're basically what you said to your boys.
Yes.
As long as you give it 100% in whatever you do, you know, that's the line that they drew. And I thought that was quite, I mean, when you have so many people, I thought to myself, well, that's a nice baseline, sort of like a, you know, rule to have, really.
Yeah. So here it says, how might we help families through the process, as you call it, when he or she owns and controls the business and wealth and believes they have the right to define the entitlement, right? So this is obviously founder or whatever gen made it very large, right? And decides, I'm going to call the shots, that's my money, right? So again, the question becomes, like you were talking about, is it a me process or is it a we process, right? And if it's a we process where it involves family, then this should not be an issue. But clearly, this is a me process where I dictate, I decide, and you're just happen to be my children or whatever people that they're referring to.
I think it's a difficult question because I actually don't believe that we can change anyone, right? Like even if you come in as a third party advisor, or if you're very good at that, we all know that I can't change you, Faisal, you can't change me, right? Like that's the thing, like there has to be an inherent own decision to wanting to do it differently. I would absolutely never claim that I would know how to change someone's mind about that. I do think though that where we are definitely at when it comes to talking about family businesses is that we have enough stories and case studies today that show you the consequences of certain behavior, and that at some point you can come to the point with a patriarch or a matriarch when you discuss this with them, where you can almost scientifically now prove that certain behavior will have detrimental consequences for the next generation. And then that person will have to, I guess, be a little bit confronted with a yes or no question. It's like, if you're doing this for the legacy, then here are the conditions for everyone to be on board. And if you're doing it for the ego, which honestly, no one can blame them as well. Like people sacrifice enormous amounts of their lives to build these kinds of businesses. If you're doing it for the ego, then, you have to expect the following consequences. You have to understand that you're going to have to be able to live with that. So it's what my father would call, you do scenario planning. My dad is a big believer in that, like scenario planning. And I think he's right, like it's about like, well, okay, like let's assume this is the decision that you take. So we have seen by these, I'm like the case study I've just given you from the family business in Costa Rica.
It's amazing.
It's amazing, right? Like, and I think families, that's why families, like we need other families, right? Like to talk to, we need to talk to each other. It's very important because it's how we learn. So I would say like, that would be my view on like, how you obviously never expecting that you can change someone's mind, because God knows I've tried and it doesn't work. It doesn't work, Faisal.
Well, they tried with you, and then that's the reciprocate. Anyway, so I'm going to ask the next question in my own perspective. So let's say my two boys came to you, okay, and they know that they have the equivalent of a family health office that's funded. They have their medical insurance funded. They have education funded. And they have an entrepreneurship funded, but there's nothing else in terms of, what I call piss money, but it's, day-to-day money, whatever. And they want to have a conversation with me about quote unquote entitlement or expectation. To me, I think the word entitlement is a little bit overdone too, personally. I think it's judgment. Just the word itself is judging, from my perspective. It's just to have an honest conversation. To me, it's, Dad, they call me Baba, right? Baba, I understand your position. We would like to understand the logic behind blah, 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 right? So what would you recommend to them to be able to speak to me about maybe, why do I not get a roof over my head, as an example, right? Or why do I not get some kind of allowance, right? Because there is an issue. I told them, what if you are an entrepreneur and it doesn't work, right? So what happens to the money?
I think it starts much earlier. I would probably ask your sons how much they actually know about your story. How well do you think you know your father? When's the last time, like, ask yourself, like, do you talk about like, that person's history as well? And I think what we take, again, this comes back to what I said earlier, we take it for granted that we know the other people just because we're related. And the weird thing is, like, we go into these difficult conversations having these expectations already. We're like, you know, it's like the self-fulfilling prophecy principle, right? Like, sort of, you go into this thinking like, well, you know what, I know that, you know, this person is like this. I know that Baba is like that. Like, you know, he's gonna, and so you go into it with almost like a manipulative, I guess, like, you know, the sense of like, okay, how am I going to, because I would never encourage your sons to have a discussion with you if it's to get something from you. Because having these kinds of discussions are very bad for the relationship, because eventually the other person is going to figure out we're having this conversation because they're trying to get something. I'm supposed to give them something. They're trying to, it's a demand. It's not about us. It's like very, very well put. It's about them and not about us. And I think
but
that
to
hurts.
Understand, right? They want to understand the thought process. They want to understand the logic.
Well,
right?
I think that
is that tough love, or is it just your way?
Well, I think, you know, it's very important for us to understand where the other person comes from. Like, I can't, like, look, Faisal, you can't help it. Your childhood was very different from theirs.
Yeah.
Theirs is very different from yours. It's the same thing for us. We have, like, I think my childhood couldn't be more different from what my parents have been through themselves. Like opposite worlds, literally.
Yeah.
And it's very important to understand that if you don't take a genuine interest in how that person has experienced their own lives, whether you agree with it or not. Like, you know, it's very interesting. My two sisters and I, we often look at each other. It's really interesting. We grew up in the same house, same parents. My parents were very adamant about loving us the same. 3 different childhoods. If you ask us the most defining moments of our childhood, we will all tell you different events. Respecting that, I think, is the first step. Understanding why, when you go to your father, like, you know, if they come to you and ask you something, why that could trigger you, why that could be difficult for you and stuff like that. To understand where the other person comes from is very important, because I think empathy, right? Like, it's so important. Empathy and understanding, like, you know, and it's not always easy, Faisal, because quite frankly, like, you know, sometimes in families we get very irrational reactions to each other, and it's very painful, and it's really just because we know each other's buttons, and, you know, you really have to, you know, not be that person, right? Like, to push those buttons, right? Like, because it's not nice. But yeah, I think, like, you know, only seek this conversation if you're willing to come from an honest place of interest, and not just that the conversation is the objective, not the conversation is the means towards you, like, you know, achieving something else. That's what I would tell your boys, basically. If this is what you're after, the conversation itself needs to be a good experience, then I would encourage them definitely to do that. Not if you are trying to achieve a goal
as a means to an end. I mean, is this conversation a means to an end? Is Baba and this conversation a means to an end, or is it an end in itself, right?
Exactly.
It's the anatomy of peace, right? Orbis Institute, that's what they teach you when you to show up. All right, we've got a couple more minutes left. We've answered a number of questions. Some closing remarks from you in terms of steps or ideas or something we didn't touch on, something you'd like to share, on topic, off topic. It's, you know, it's all good.
Well, I think it's important to understand the world we live in. I'm a big believer in contextualizing, especially when it comes to family businesses that want to last for generations. And I'm saying this very cognizant of the fact that we're currently living through probably one of the weirder times, like, you know, of this century, likely, you know, unless like the alien invasion is around the corner, which many people predict. So that's going to be interesting. So, but I think, like, it's very important to contextualize the times we live in. So, for instance, I feel like this topic of entitlement or ego is very interesting in a time of social media, right? Or generally the kind of technology that we have at our disposal. You know, we all have our own channels at our disposal, right? Like, everyone can broadcast to the world, everyone can show that to the world, etc., and stuff like that. And I just find it very interesting. Like, I know that a lot of people are like, oh, social media and blah, 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 and everything. But, like, you know, if you look at it from a purely anthropological point of view, there's never been a time where you've been able to learn so much about what matters to different people as today. because privacy concerns aside, everybody is just like putting it out there. You know, it's like crazy, right? Like it's insane. Like if you think about it, like I always feel like, you know, people saying like, you know, the millennials entitled and stuff. I said like, yeah, but we will never get our privacy back. So like leave us something, you know what I mean? Like, because we fell straight into that trap. We were the early adopters. So we're never going to get that back. And I think that it's an interesting time if you're willing to listen, if you're willing to really listen and get out of your own comfort zone and maybe, you know, read about people that are not exactly in agreement with you, or like, you know, read about like, you know, stories that are not exactly happening in your backyard, but try to open your mind to the fact that we live in a world where there's a huge opportunity, because there's a lot of points of views that are being shared. And I think that can help you as well, because it brings the most important ingredient, according to my mother, and she's right, it brings that sense of relativity of your situation. How important is that Porsche if, you know, other people have, you know, just been crushed by a hurricane, for instance, or whatever, right? Like I'm making a very banal example right now, but it's not just a bad thing, all of this content and the internet and all of these things. It can be a real tool for people to realize that, okay, first, you're not alone, and you can get educated on, is what I'm experiencing a real problem, or is it a problem to me, right? And are there ways to get over this? And I think we live in a world where that is absolutely possible if you look at it from a positive, constructive side. Yeah.
All right. Well, just on that note, right, I hope everybody has found this as educational as I have. I'm going to now take that Costa Rica example and relook at my own foundation to rethink, because the question of what happens if they don't want to start companies, or they don't because they have funds to start 3 startups each. You know, what happens with doesn't happen or is not successful? What happens, right? And I think that's an alternative to align with the expectation of give everything you have, of what example you gave. So, and going back to the education piece, I hope that, you know, I found the sharing incredible and very educational. So I hope that we can add this to the arsenal of, you know, discussions on entitlement. And I think that it was less charged as other conversations I've had, because like I said, there's already judgment in the word, which I find slightly, honestly, unacceptable, because, you know, who are we to even go to that space, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you very much, Ramia. I'm sure we're going to have another webinar, if it wasn't too painful for you, in the near future.
I'm still here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you for doing all of this. Thank you.
And I'm sure you'll come up with a juicy title again.
Even though I'll do my best.
You claimed that it was my doing. Not just alignment.
Of course, I will blame you. That is for sure.
So I'll take all the credit for the amazing conversation we had. Thank you.
Welcome to it.
I'm entitlement.
You're entitled to it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to be joined next week by Jay, who's going to talk about how well-being is impacting the C-suite. And he himself is a CIO and working with a lot of the founders and other CIOs and COOs and CEOs, and talking about how the general well-being, physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, is impacting the individual that he speaks to and does webinars with. All right, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ramia, again. Truly, bon appetit if you haven't had your salad yet, and we'll see you soon. All right.
Thank you. Bye.